Kia ora, ko Ruapahu te maunga, ko Moawhanga te awa, ko Steamship Taufua te waka, ko Ngāti Tumatuenga te iwi, ko Gavin Willbond ingoa tōku. And it's good to see some others from Ngāti Tumatuenga here today. Kia ora. So yeah, we're going to talk about changing from how we currently do risk to how we should be doing risk. But first we need to define some stuff. Okay, like my predecessors have spoken about, let's get some definitions out of the way first. So oftentimes I'll hear people talking about a controls assessment and a gap analysis as if they are a risk assessment. Those things are completely separate. Now, controls assessment and a gap analysis are absolutely important, and they are key, and those are things you've got to do up front. And they're part of a risk analysis or a risk assessment, but by themselves they aren't. The other thing I often hear is that risk is likelihood, or risk is not likelihood. Risk does not equal likelihood. Okay, the risk equation that I subscribe to is risk equals condition plus consequence. And that comes out of Carnegie Mellon University in the US, and they've had huge years of determining what risk is and isn't. Now, the consequence, or the condition includes the likelihood of something happening. Okay, so likelihood is a part of risk in the same way that a controls assessment and a gap analysis are parts of risk assessment. I think we'd all agree that likelihood is part of, but is not fully a risk. Okay, and we've got to talk about the consequence being the impact in the context of the organisation. I'm going to use the case example of a council. So we've got about 90% of the councils around New Zealand are our clients. This particular council I'm about to talk about today is not in the room today. There are some councils in the room today. It's not you. So, a couple of months ago, we were doing a controls assessment and a gap analysis, and we identified very early on in that this particular council had established a guest Wi-Fi network about 4 years prior, and the password hadn't changed. So that's cool. We also identified that guest Wi-Fi network was connected directly to their corporate network. Not so fine. And that corporate network was again connected directly to their SCADA network. Definitely not fine. So the IT guy, who was relatively new, had gone upstairs and he had spoken to his lords and masters and tried to get some permission to change some stuff, and he was told, nah, it's been like that for the last 4 years. Who cares about it? Nothing's happened in the last 4 years. So I got a communication. I created an email which I sent to the chief exec, who I'd had a previous working relationship with. We had delivered some training to him, and I said, look, what could happen is anyone who's had the Wi-Fi access to the Wi-Fi network over the last 4 years could actually access your corporate network. And the impact to you of that is that you could see all of your salaries on the front page of tomorrow's paper and have a huge number of personal grievances to deal with. You could also see the whole dog control database on the front page of tomorrow's paper, because criminals who employ hackers to break into systems, criminals that are going to go and start breaking into houses in your district want to know who owns dogs. And they're not going to break into those houses, they're going to go next door. And I went on to say that I'd hate to see the outcome of the investigation into sewage flowing down the streets when it's identified that the reason sewage is flowing down the streets in your district is because someone cracked in through your guest Wi-Fi network. 20 minutes later, I got a phone call. Hey, I don't know what you sent, Gavin, but I've been instructed to turn the guest Wi-Fi network off and reconfigure the stuff and separate the networks. Because what happened is the chief executives don't care about IT problems. They've got nerds to deal with that stuff. They've got people that deal with that. What they want to know is what's going to impact them. What's going to cause them to lose sleep? What's going to cause their name to appear on the front page of tomorrow's paper? That's what they care about, and that's the risk language that we've got to talk about. Okay, I want to talk about consequence as well. If there's no consequence, I would argue that there's no risk. You might have an area of concern, you might have something that needs to be addressed at some stage, but if there's no consequence, no impact to the organisation, then let's not call it a risk. Okay, and I'll show you an example, a real live one. A handful of years ago, I was involved in an investigation where someone had lost a USB device that contained information classified secret. So my question to you is there a risk that the confidentiality of that information is being compromised? Now, the initial answer is, oh yeah, of course there is. But let's investigate a little bit further and find out some more information. Okay, it's an iron key. It's got a 21-character password that contains uppercase, lowercase numbers and symbols. It was lost in a very sandy place overseas. So it was determined that, there was no risk to the confidentiality of that information that was classified secret. The security organisation in the government department I was working for had determined, well, actually, based on the fact that it's the 21-character complex password, which is going to take 130 trillion years to crack it, guessing at 1,000 passwords a second, let's not worry about the fact that USB device has been lost. In effect, it was a $250 phishing sinker. So there's no impact, all right? So no risk. So how do we assess risk these days? Okay, we do it point in time. We have a look at what our risk is right now. We often confuse compliance with risk, or we have a compliance focus. Oh, we've got to send some form in somewhere sometime soon that says that we've ticked some boxes. Well, let's check to make sure that we can answer that we've ticked those boxes. Let's not do that. Let's look at risk, actually risk. Okay, and we add it to a risk register, right? We punch our stuff into a risk register, and that thing there is normally discussed at a quarterly meeting, right? And the conversation sometimes goes like this: oh, I reckon that red one, I reckon that's orange now. Anyone disagree with that? Okay, well, let's change it to orange then. So we change it to orange, okay, with no analysis behind that. Okay, sometimes what we do is we might assign a task, or we might review a task that has been assigned. Okay, well, we might not. Sometimes we might just forget about it until next quarter. Let's have another conversation about it, another meaningless conversation about this line in a risk register that no one really understands or is doing analysis on. Okay, I'm going to talk about an example. I think it was Paul that alluded earlier on to the NZX situation that occurred in August of last year. So the Financial Markets Authority did an investigation into this DDoS attack that we all read about, and they published this report. So if you want to find the report, just Google NZX DDoS 2020 first response. So the FMA published this report last month. So they identified that while the NZX did maintain an IT risk register, whole bunches of stuff were recorded as in progress. Anyone ever seen that before? Yeah, it's common, eh? That meant that the real ability to address that risk and manage it and mitigate it effectively was extremely slow. However, the NZX's crystal ball was working when they put together that risk register, which is pretty cool news. Yeah, they'd identified that we could have a DDoS attack. Yeah. So they put it on the IT risk register. The IT risk register. Thinking about IT problems, not organisational problems. But its overall risk severity score was a little bit low because we hadn't assessed it properly. So what else did they say? They said that the ranking itself didn't seem right, considering that there was all these DDoS attacks occurring last year and the previous year. I mean, these things aren't new, right? We've been seeing DDoS attacks and an increasing number of DDoS attacks over the last handful of years. So at least they had registered it, okay, they'd identified it, but they hadn't recorded the severity of it as high as it should have been, particularly given their industry was being hit. International peer exchanges were all being smashed with DDoS attacks, and yet it was sitting on a IT risk register, and some stuff was in progress. So that's pretty cool. So what was the actual impact? Okay, it wasn't an IT impact, right? Markets had to be closed, right? Trading was halted for 5 days. Not everyone that trades has to go through the nzx.com website. There's a lot of brokering activity that occurs outside of the nzx.com website. Yet all trading was halted for 5 days. Okay, investor confidence was lost. Our economy, The ability for our economy to operate and function effectively relies on market confidence. Okay, and it negatively impacted participants and the broader market ecosystem. Real impact, eh? Real impact not just to the NZX, but to New Zealand's economy over that period, because they had identified some IT risk, and it was in a register, and it was in progress. It's being dealt with. Okay, so what's the problem with how we do it? I mean, there's a clear example, but we have potentially very poor risk governance. Okay, but we've recorded it. Okay, what's next? Oftentimes we have a lack of established risk measurement criteria. Who in the room knows what their risk measurement criteria is? Don't put your hands up, but just think about and answering that yourselves. You know, that's where we've got our different impact areas that are listed. And it's where we've got our low, moderate, and high, or your organisation might have very low, low, moderate, high, and really, really high. Whatever your risk measurement criteria is, that's what it is. Now, the reason you've got to have that clearly articulated is you don't get a situation like this. I might think that from let's look at fines and legal penalties. I think that $10,000 is pretty low as far as fines go. Up to $50,000 is probably moderate, and anything above $50,000 is high, has a high impact to the organisation. Yet, the organisation may have actually determined that anything up to $250,000 is low, anything up to $500,000 is moderate, and above $500,000 is high impact. But what we need to do is we all need to be everyone who's having a risk-based discussion in your organisation needs to be singing off the same hymn sheet, or else it's a meaningless discussion. When you're ranking your highs, your moderates, and your lows, you've got to be singing off the same hymn sheet. Oh, accountability. Who's authorised to make those risk decisions? Are there any project managers in the room? Oh, good, because I was going to say if there are any, then it's not you, it's others, okay? Oftentimes, project managers, their success is measured on the ability to get the project out the gate on time. Right, would you agree with that? So oftentimes what happens is they will accept risk through convenience, so the project gets out the gate on time. But the risk might not be theirs to accept. The impact to the organisation may be well outside of their pay grade. Yet we allow them, because of poor risk governance in the organisation, we allow the wrong people to make those risk-based decisions. Oftentimes there's no monitoring of mitigation. Has the mitigation been implemented? Yeah, we've got it on the spreadsheet, you've got to do this. Has it been done? Who did it? Where was it done? Was it done on all the servers or just a couple, just for now? And we'll see how it goes. Was it done correctly? We've got a client, this is only a couple of weeks ago, and one of my colleagues is going to talk about TLS further later on, but he's going to talk about in the context of email. I'm going to talk about TLS in the context of websites. So there was a requirement for this client to have TLS 1.2 implemented. Okay, and they'd implemented that. Yeah, we checked it. Yep, they've implemented it. And then we checked to see if TLS 1.1 was still operational on their website, and it was. And TLS 1.0. So, obviously the vulnerabilities that have been fixed through the implementation of 1.2 were still open to exploit because 1.1 and 1.0 were open. It's kind of like for if there's any non-tech people in the room, we've always had doors on our houses, right? Now, once upon a time, someone came along and said, I reckon we should put locks on those doors. So what happens is you get the carpenter in, he comes and he cuts a hole and he puts a door in there and it's got a lock on it, job done, walk away. But the old door's still there. So people can just walk up and open it and walk in without going through the locked door. Okay, that's what we're talking about. When we're going to implement something, we've got to make sure it's implemented correctly. Is the mitigation still working as expected? And I'll talk a little bit more about that real soon. Often we're only looking about the inherent and residual risk. Okay, and again, I need to talk about that a little bit shortly. And it gives us a false sense of security. Right, so we've got a number of different risk types that we often talk about. You know, we all know that inherent risk is assuming that there's either no controls in place or all of the controls have failed, right? So there's no effective controls. And at the other end, we've got our residual risk, which means every control is working as expected, as we need it to. But there's the most important risk that we often overlook is what's our risk picture right now? What's our risk picture today? Some of the controls that we thought were in place aren't in place. Some of them that we thought were working properly aren't working properly. So what's our risk picture right now? And that's the most important risk, I would argue. So what's the solution? Okay, we do have a risk-based focus rather than compliance, but man, forget about having to tick boxes for the sake of ticking boxes. Please have risk discussions. Okay? We need to have governance that reflects that. We need to establish that risk measurement criteria. The whole organisation needs to be singing the same sheet. Okay? We need to have risk management policy and processes that support that policy. And we need to have that near and real-time reporting to our governance team, right, to our boards and execs. They need to have a good understanding of what that current risk is today. The risk owners need to have access to that information as well, and they need to have the confidence and the authority to make decisions based on the changing risk picture as it changes in real time or near time. Okay, and our security staff also need to have the access to that information and the confidence and the ability, the authority to respond to the changing situation. So what do? We have continuous assessment and visibility. So our near real-time questions answered, okay? Our controls are assessed with an expiry date. So certification and accreditation in New Zealand government, right? Every 2 years you're meant to recertify. I've never done a recertification for any of our clients after 2 years. It's always 3 years or 4 years or you know, when we get round to it, then call you in and find some money to recertify to make sure things are still fine. You know, what we do is we assess the controls and we put an expiry date on those controls. Some of them might be 6 months' time. They should be reassessed every 6 months. Some of them might be 12 or 18, whatever. A risk-based decision to determine the expiry of their control. And then when that control expires, let's go back and reassess the control so we understand what our risk picture is right now. All of our controls have got to be tied to risks. If we're implementing controls for the sake of implementing controls because some vendor said, oh, you need to buy this flash whiz-bang thing, if it's not tied to a risk, it's a waste of your money. You've got to tie your controls to your risks, okay? And it also provides better risk management. Now, both Paul and Tim have spoken a little bit about incident response. I'm not going to go on about all aspects of incident response. You know, we know that the incident responders, the technical team, have their element. We know the comms team, the legal team, the C-suite. We know, there's all these different parts of incident response. Okay, I'm going to focus on the risk elements of it. So an incident occurs, right? Something happens. So what happens is the only reason that's occurred is because there's been a control or a number of controls that are ineffective. So first question we've got to ask ourselves is, what other risks are affected by those controls or that control that are no longer working? What's the current risk today, knowing that those controls aren't working? Who are the risk owners? Let's have a hui with them. Let's tell them what's going on, what their current risk picture is right now. And then we address the controls. And you know what? Sometimes we might have our pot of gold to address some controls. Okay, but the risk owner might also have their pot of gold, which they can support in addressing those controls because it's them that's impacted. Not you, not the IT team, not the IT security team. It's the risk owners that are affected. So they might want to contribute some funds as well. Okay, so what's the end result? Right, we've got meaningful near or real-time information that we can use to inform those extremely important business decisions. Okay, rather than some stuff in someone's drawer, gathering dust or with mouse poop on it that we did a couple of years ago. Okay, that's what we need to be working to, making sure that we are able to provide our key constituent, our risk owners, with valuable information. That's all. Thank you.